Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of a series of video programs on postgraduate research, supervision and training. This video series has been produced simply from recordings of a residential staff development program on postgraduate supervision for women held at the Twin Waters Resort on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland in April 1992. The aim of this series is to provide supervisors and postgraduate students with resources to understand and improve postgraduate studies in their department or institution.
What I thought I'd do is just go through how I see a science type, natural science, and I know there's probably physical scientists here too, see as structuring a PhD project, or you could regard it as a master's research. It's a research project, and the sorts of things that I think are important. And then what I'll do, you have got in your satchel, you were given out which I didn't know was going to happen, that everyone was going to be given a copy of it, but so you have got a copy of it. And I've also handed out a green piece of paper with the key matrices and a picture on it. What I'll do is go through what I think the main objectives of this process are, and then the specific objectives, because in a science sort of thing you always start with your objectives and then you see if you've achieved the objectives. And what I thought we might do in the workshops, and I think the smaller the better, I've always been of the opinion that if people want to work by themselves or just in pairs, that they should be allowed to do so. I always say to my students, you have to be in a group in the piggery or in the chookery or with the dairy cows, but you don't have to all work together. You can actually work in smaller groups. So I think as long as it's not greater than about 5 people, that you'll get a lot out of it, and you seem to get more out of a smaller group. So however you want to work, we'll do that. But what I want to do is to make sure we actually get something out of it at the end. And I'll put up some of the questions that I think that every group should be looking at. And then when we come together, we may be able to make a recommendation from these sciences as a whole, that these are the way we should be laying down some of our recommendations for our different departments. The first thing I think is important, these are the main objectives of what I think we're on about, is to gain a greater awareness of the processes and problems of the postgraduate research training. And we're starting to do these. These are our very main objectives. The second thing we're trying to do is to devise effective strategies of postgraduate training. We've talked a lot about this. Now, this isn't often talked about, and I think this is one of the most important things. It's all very well turning out someone with a PhD, but we want them to be an effective person. And I think we want to become highly effective people, not only as a supervisor, and a lot of us are ineffective, and I've discovered some areas where I was ineffective, and I'll show you where and what I did about it. But we also want to teach our students to be effective people, because after all, they're going into the real world, and that's what we want, people who are effective, not just bright in the head and good at writing up stuff. So our specific objectives are, first of all, to define a problem or problems, and then to select a central problem and state an hypothesis or an aim. Quite often the research grants say state an hypothesis, and I should have an hypothesis. They're the or an aim, and I think it's quite all right to have aims. I don't think you need necessarily to have an hypothesis at this stage. That's my personal feelings. Access the literature and interpret it. It's very easy to say go and do a literature review. Some students have absolutely no idea how to access the literature and interpret it. So this has to be one of our objectives. Then to construct a valid research design so data can be analysed and interpreted. And in the sciences, no matter what somebody thinks, you've got to have quantitative results as well as qualitative. In fact, we're light on quite often in qualitative results. And I'll just make a comment about that later on. As well as that, we have to be able to collect meaningful data so that it can be analysed. Many a statistician has torn their hair out when some student has gone with a whole pile of data and said, do something with it. That is absolutely hopeless. So we have to ask the right questions so we can collect the meaningful data. This is really important with a lot of science subjects. It's never been mentioned until now, where we have to make sure we get ethical clearance for the project and to make sure the NH and MRC codes are followed for an animal experiment. How many people here do animal experiments? How many people here have read the code, the latest code? Good. I say to my students, what colour cover has it got? And so you know then whether they've read it or not. And all my students know that it's got a yellow and green cover, even if they've never read any further. And I think it's our duty to sit down with our student and make sure when they tick that little square that they actually know what that code says. It is now a legal document. It is attached to the Animals Protection Act, and it has been since June last year. And if we don't follow it, we're actually doing something illegal, and that should be drummed into the students. To develop a theory in which the descriptions, explanations and predictions of their research project are systematically combined. That actually is the thesis at the end, and you'll see that on your green piece of paper. And finally, and a specific objective, I think, is to become a highly effective person with effective habits, and we often don't do this, either to ourselves or our students. We'll look now just at what good habits are, and I've taken this out of Covey's book, the 7 Habits of Effective People, and I think the book is absolutely fantastic. You can buy it in any bookshop, and it has a wealth of knowledge, and it's the most common sense book I've read about how to be effective. And he just says these are how habits are developed. To develop a good habit, you have to have skills, you've got to know how to do it, you've got to have the desire, and you've got to have the knowledge. And I think that's important to teach students. If they haven't got the skills, the desire or the knowledge, you can't develop a good habit. It's called I've got it in the notes. You should have the notes that were given out. But here it is, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it's absolutely easy to read, and it's absolutely terrific. And every student should read it, and so should every supervisor, because, you know, it does help you. How are we going to go about this, being effective and having good habits? Well, he has what is called a time matrix, and you've got it on your green piece of paper. And this is really fascinating. And when I read this, I realised that I wasted a lot of time. He's divided things into urgent activities and non-urgent activities, important and not so important. Now, if you look very carefully down these, by the way, PC activities, that PC stands for I'll just read out what it's defined as. PC is defined as production capability, and that's the asset you have to produce something. So PC activities are things like building up relationships, accessing the library properly, recognising new opportunities, planning, recreation. They are things you do to produce something. So that's what that means. Now, you look carefully at those, and you'll quite often see that activities are urgent, important. They're crises. They arise. You've got to do something straight away. They're pressing problems. They're deadlines. You've got to fill in your grant proposal. Or the student has to send in the 6 monthly report. They're fairly important. They're urgent and they're important. But if that takes over your life, you've really had it. You'll live high stress, non-management, you're always rushing from one thing to the other. So while that is extraordinarily important to deal with, you shouldn't have to do it all the time. And if you look down here, you'll find some of the things you do are interruptions. These are urgent because you have to deal with them, but they're not important. And I found that I was always answering the damn telephone. And someone would ring up and say, my cat's just vomited all over the floor. What am I going to do with it? My dog's just fought with the dog next door. The cat's stolen the clothes of the woman next door. The cat's eaten the carpet. You know, all of these sort of things. Interruptions, interruptions, interruptions. Why should somebody interrupt you when you are having a conference with a student? Your student's made an appointment to see you. Your student's sitting there and the phone rings. What do people do? They leap up and answer the phone. That's terrible. You shouldn't do that. It's not important. They can ring up later. So you have to organise your life so that those sort of activities don't overtake it. Now, students are the same. It's very easy to do easy things. What's some examples that my students do that waste time, that they think they're being busy? I call it busy work, and you don't have to do it. Oh, well, the students who will take their data, have it in a book and then rewrite it because it looks untidy. That's sort of busy data, a busy sort of work. And rush along to meetings, do some reports. Well, half of them you can throw in the garbage bin. And these are the sort of things I think we should be teaching our students, not to spend time in this quadrant or that quadrant. Again, this is trivia, busy work. There's a person in our department who does this all the time. That's all he ever does. Busy work, and he rushes from A to B and does nothing. These are really quite important too, and this is your planning. They're not urgent, but they're important. And if you can teach your student to plan how their thesis is going, to have deadlines, to work towards doing their literature review. I have a rule with my students when they first come is they have to do their literature review in the first year they're there. And they may change it a little bit, but they've actually done something. And that means you've got it not urgent, but it's important, and they're gradually doing these things. So the very effective person works a little bit in this quadrant and quite a bit in that quadrant, and not very much in these two. And that's the one I show my students, and I say, well, let's try and stay mainly up here so we don't have crises. But every so often you have to do something. If your rats run away, that's a pressing problem. You've got to go and do something about it. Or the pig in the pen next door jumps into the other one and gets eaten. You know, there are things you have to do on the time. And this is how you make a thesis. And I've put it on that green piece of paper too. You've got your green bit of paper. And I want you to have a look at that, because that's actually how a science thesis is constructed. You can have all these problems, and as I've said, they're testable and repeatable and so on. Then from those problems you sit there with the student and you say, well, this is the problem area. What are you going to work on? What are your aims, or what are you going to do? And this is where I thought perhaps the female and male might, be even quite different at that stage, what they wanted to work on. This is the thesis, as you see on the green piece of paper there. I've put the thesis in the middle, and the thesis really is your theory. You've pulled all this together to make a nice story that some examiner will give you a pass for. You've got to have a good research design. Obviously, you've got to measure things, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You can, and some of my sort of stuff is actually ranking things, which again isn't an actual measurement, but you can certainly do ranking things, collecting the appropriate data for the questions you ask, and interpreting and so on. And what I thought as a group we might do, if you want to get something out of it, which I think we really should start doing, is these are on your piece of paper in your satchel, but otherwise if you haven't got them, I thought each group could look at these sort of things. And what I think we should be looking at is, first of all, how do we go about defining the problem? Now, I'm not going to say how I think. That's what I think we should talk about in the group. I debated whether to get each group to do something different, but I don't think it's a good idea, although you see what you think. I thought that everybody as a group should use most of those sort of things and have a plan, because I think between the groups we might end up with a fairly standard sort of plan that we see as important for giving our students when they're going to start their research projects. So I've put there defining the problem, how we go about doing that. obviously we've got to reach some way to help the student. These are to help the student define the problem, make sure it only takes 3.5 years, because that's what the university says, and that's when your research grant's cut out anyway. It's pointless having something that you can't possibly finish in that time. How do we go about setting a timetable for task completion? And you might use some of those matrices. How do you actually teach a student to plan a literature review? What do you actually say to them? How do you do it? How do you plan data collection? What are you going to collect? What sort of data? How do you go about getting statistical advice on design if that isn't one of your expertises? You run along to agriculture and ask Kay Basford to help you. No, you might have a colleague that is willing to cooperate with you, and I think we should think more about cooperation. One very important thing I just want to say about this is getting statistical advice. Many a time over the past 10 years, people have given statistical advice for theses and have never got any acknowledgement whatsoever in the papers or the thesis itself. And to me, the statistician is one of the key people and should be acknowledged and should be part of the project. That's my personal feeling. How do you help the student organise resources, materials and animals? If you're going to do an animal project, how do you go about it? To help the student talk to other students who may be working in a similar area and may have problems. How do you go about arranging regular meetings with the student and the supervisor? How do you make sure that the students read the NH and MRC codes and filled in the ethics forms? They're the sort of things I think the workshop should come up with how to go about.
One of the students' biggest problems is getting access to their supervisor.
Oh, that's another one. Yes.
Is that part of the negotiation?
Yes.
The students say, I want an hour a week for the first 6 months.
Yes.
And what redress have they got?
Sorry, what?
Redress.
They're going to the postgraduate committee, so that's really difficult. Just set the aims. And then we can do the aims, do we, or the hypothesis or whatever you call it, and set the aims. Aims,
And resources.
yes, resources. We did happen to call them step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 because that's an easy way to think. But we are going to write a page that goes with this to say that these steps can be taken out of order, although some of them obviously have to be in order. And the first thing we did after our selection of our student was to then do our negotiations with the student. And we've made several suggestions about how you negotiate, not actually a contract, but certainly the expectations of the student and the supervisor, and select suitable project areas. And we came to the conclusion that certainly the supervisor should have a good knowledge of the topic or the methodology in that field. And we also at that stage believe that setting up a timetable for access to the supervisor is extremely important. That's all done in the very beginning. The second thing we went on to do was to define a question. Now, this question doesn't have to be very specific. It has to be an area, but then we look at aims and the focus of the actual project. We look at the resources, the time frame and the feasibility of doing this in the time frame. Then in the realistic world you have to make some sort of proposal and enrol the students, so you do have to have a reasonable idea what you're doing, and we have a tentative title and our ethical clearance at that stage because you have to have that to enrol. There was a bit of wondering whether at this stage we should show students what a thesis looks like. Some people thought it was a good idea and some people thought it wasn't. I personally think it's probably a good idea, but other people thought maybe it might frighten them a bit. The next step is how to go about a literature review, because there was some concern when you should actually do this literature review, and there was a bit of division, but as I say, just because these are labelled certain steps, they can be put in different orders. But certainly at some stage you've got to do a literature review, and most of us favoured doing it pretty quick, starting off pretty quickly, finding out about how you access the library. We felt that wasn't the supervisor's personal problem, but to say there's the library over there, go and ask someone how to do things, but to sit down and work out some key words and the key authors, and perhaps give the students some key references so they have a vague idea what everything's about that they've worked out, and that for them to start right at the beginning to do their database. Then we had them returning to the supervisor and planning how to do the actual review and how to write a critical review and how to define headings and plan a literature review. One of the good suggestions was to give a literature review seminar to a group, so that some other people in the group might say, well, you haven't thought about so-and-so, or you haven't thought about this area, so that the student has a bit of a talk about what goes into the literature review. The fifth step was getting going, where we believe it's very important to establish ancillary skills for the student, to design and determine and teach the experimental or field procedures that the student needs. One thing we feel is very important in a natural science is to talk to a statistician and plan data collection. Now, sometimes you don't actually need the statistician, but you certainly need to plan the data collection, so that's very important at that stage. Then the recording procedures. They've been laid down by the University of Queensland very recently, how you have to keep a proper lab book, and that's known as the Good Laboratory Practice Manual. And there are very strict rules, and you've got to keep them for 6 years, so you don't want to take too much data or your room piles up with data. You've got to keep it for 6 years. Critical path planning. This means that not necessarily do your experiments or your work have to go sequentially. They can actually run in parallel together, and that's very important if you're going to finish it, your thesis, in the right time. And we've got on the bottom that start now, so the student's now ready to go. The next step was frequent meetings with the supervisor, where the supervisor keeps after the student and the student keeps after the supervisor. And obviously it's extremely important that from now on to be monitoring the data collection and the procedures, to modify if necessary, and we all felt it was extremely important to start encouraging detailed documentation and writing up of the methodology, so the students starting to learn how to write. Now, at the same time, the literature review, we saw the literature review is taking place at the same time. And then the next key thing was to give it to the supervisor for comment and feedback. And then there's ongoing analysis and interpretation of data within the thesis context, so that you're looking at your data and you're saying, well, now I've got my question, how is this fitting in with what I'm trying to make a story about? We thought the next step was called communication, where we encourage the student to write up articles, papers, give seminars, give conference papers, and we regard this as the process of critical feedback, and we encourage at this stage networking, so the student gets to know the people in the area. One of the suggestions was to try to get to overseas conferences and local ones, and some of us groaned and said we can't do it, but in fact you can quite often, and I know my students already managed to get herself more than half the fare to go to Montreal this year, and you can do it by various means, but I think it's up to the supervisor to help. Then one of the other good suggestions was to have very regular research in progress seminars. They only need to be extremely short, but just so the student comes and says to a little group of people, look, I'm doing this and that and I don't know where to go next, what do you reckon? And they're very, very useful. Now, in with those, we haven't finished. We're going to finish after 5 because we're a very conscientious group and we're dying to finish. We're actually enthusiastic to finish. So step 8 will be how to write the thesis. We haven't done that yet. The introduction we haven't done yet on how to use this data. But we have another one called pitfalls, which doesn't have a number because you can put it in anywhere. And the pitfalls are from the student point of view, this basically is avoiding isolation and by forming support groups of students, interaction with other academics. Some students feel that they should have other academics. Attendance at seminars by other academics and postgraduates, and this probably would be a departmental policy. Building up social peer groups, and somebody explained how they got together and had lunch together and had their peer group socialisation, and it was initiated by the students, and also to point the students in the direction of the Postgraduate Association where they could get some fellowship and help from other students. So we have 2 more pages to go yet.
The complete recommendations resulting from this workshop are published in the Manual for Conducting Workshops on Postgraduate Supervision, edited by Zuber-Skerritt, and available from General Administration, the Tertiary Education Institute, the University of Queensland, 4072.